Hello, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles. Episode 1.40, Questioning the United Kingdom. In the last episode of the History in the Bible, I discussed two of the biblical books attributed to Solomon, Proverbs and the Song of Songs. Solomon was credited with 5 others: Ecclesiastes, the Wisdom of Solomon, the Psalms of Solomon, the Odes of Solomon, and the Testament of Solomon. Some made it into the various Bibles, some did not. In this episode, I'll briefly discuss those other 5 books, and then launch into a discussion about what modern scholarship has to say about the entire United Kingdom, from Saul to Solomon. Let's start with the third of the books attributed to the great king, Ecclesiastes. This is the most radical book in the Old Testament. It appears in all Bibles. The English title derives from the Greek, a member of an assembly. It is known in Hebrew as Kohelet, the collector of sayings, or perhaps sage or preacher. It is one of the shortest books in the Old Testament. Thanks to the King James Version, its opening words are famous. Quote, Ecclesiastes 1:1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labour, which he taketh under the sun? For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. End quote. In the more prosaic translation of the Jerusalem Study Bible, quote, the words of Kohelet, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Utter futility, said Kohelet. Utter futility, all is futile. What real value is there for a man in all the gains he makes beneath the sun? For as wisdom grows, vexation grows. To increase learning is to increase heartache. End quote. This is not a book you would want to lend to a suicidally inclined friend. Modern scholars doubt that Solomon had anything to do with it. The language and tenor of the book speaks to a people subject to foreign domination, either Persian or Greek. Kohelet, the preacher, is a literary figure, not a historical one. In the 20th century, Ecclesiastes was reintroduced to new audiences through the bird song. From Ecclesiastes chapter 3. This is the most sceptical book in the Old Testament, even outclassing the book of Job. If there is one theme that runs through the entire Old Testament, it is that the good will be rewarded and the evil punished, even if it takes generations. The author of Ecclesiastes rejects that. Quote, Ecclesiastes 9:2. For the same fate is in store for all, for the righteous and for the wicked, for the good and pure and for the impure, for him who sacrifices and for him who does not, for him who is pleasing and for him who is displeasing, and for him who swears and for him who shuns oaths. That is the sad thing about all that goes on under the sun, that the same fate is in store for all. The dead know nothing. Their loves, their hates, their jealousies have long since perished, and they have no more share till the end of time in all that goes on under the sun. End quote. Most see the book as an attempt to answer life's big questions. Others see it as the testament of a jaded and bitterly cynical rich man in old age, wondering what the hell it was all about, knowing he will soon die. This is Donald Trump or Rupert Murdoch in his last wheezing hours. Quote, Ecclesiastes 2:4. I multiplied mine possessions. I built myself houses and I planted vineyards. I laid out gardens and groves. I constructed pools of water, enough to irrigate a forest shooting up with trees. I bought male and female slaves. I also acquired more cattle, both herds and flocks, than all who were before me in Jerusalem. I further amassed silver and gold and treasures, and I got myself male and female singers, as well as the luxuries of commoners, coffers and coffers of them. Thus I gained more wealth than anyone before me. I loathed all the wealth that I was gaining under the sun, for I shall leave it to the man who will succeed me, and who knows whether he will be wise or foolish. And he will control all the wealth that I gained by toil and wisdom under the sun. That too is futile. And so I came to view with despair all the gains I had made under the sun." End quote. The rabbis were deeply conflicted about Ecclesiastes. They were disturbed that it seemed to denigrate the Torah's claimed supremacy. Those opening verses that dismissed all labour under the sun as worthless imply that the study of the Torah was useless. The rabbis came to a happy accommodation by deciding that the study of the Torah was above the sun and beyond the strictures in the book. Perhaps the only thing that let Ecclesiastes sneak into the canon was its final chapter, which spins on a dime and pretends that the previous 11 chapters never happened. Quote, Ecclesiastes 12:13. "The sum of the matter, when all is said and done, revere God and observe his commandments. For this applies to all mankind, that God will call every creature to account for everything unknown, be it good or bad. The sum of the matter, when all is said and done, revere God and observe his commandments, for this applies to all mankind." Fourth of the biblical books attributed to Solomon is the Wisdom of Solomon, also simply called Wisdom, found in Catholic, Orthodox and Ethiopian canons. Protestants regard it as apocryphal. You can read it for instruction, but not for doctrine. The Jewish tradition ignores it completely. In the 4th century AD, St. Jerome thought it was a load of old rubbish, but his colleague St. Augustine defended it as a true work of Solomon, and so it was accepted by the Catholic Church. The Wisdom of Solomon incorporates many ideas from the Greek philosopher Plato, possibly the most influential thinker in the history of Western civilization. This, and some other textual clues, leads most to believe that it was written by a Hellenized Jew living in Egypt about 50 BC, in the early Roman period. Plato believed that the world we see and live in was a defective shadow version of a higher immaterial realm. He thought that all reality was an emanation from this higher dominion, perhaps layers of emanations, graduating from the pure essence of the One to our gross material world. The Jewish author of the Wisdom of Solomon took that on board, merging it with the idea of wisdom written about in Proverbs. Here's an example, quote, Wisdom 7:25. "For wisdom is a breath of the might of God, and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore nothing defiled can enter into her. For she is the reflection of eternal light, the spotless mirror of the power of God, the image of his goodness. Although she is one, she can do all things, and she renews everything while herself perduring. Passing into holy souls from age to age, she produces friends of God and prophets. For God loves nothing so much as the one who dwells with wisdom." End quote. 3 other works attributed to Solomon floated around antiquity, but never made it into anyone's Bible: the Psalms of Solomon, the Odes of Solomon, and the Testament of Solomon. The oldest is the Psalms of Solomon, a collection of 18 laments and hopeful expectations. Since the author attributes them to Solomon and not David, they must have been written after the book of Psalms proper was finalized. The Psalms lament the arrogance of the corrupt and illegitimate Judean rulers who have been justly punished and overthrown by Gentiles from the west. But these rulers are little better, and will soon be overthrown by a son of David. All the textual clues point to the authors as devout Jews living in Jerusalem. The object of their dismay is possibly the conquest of the city by the Roman general Pompey in 63 BC. The Psalms were probably written in the decades following. The Psalms are exceptional in providing the earliest solid description of the man who will save Israel and the new government he will establish. The Psalms call him the Lord Messiah or the Lord's Messiah, depending on which manuscript you trust most. In the Old Testament, Messiah is a vague term used to describe any legitimate priest or king, and simply means anointed. The Persian king Cyrus the Great is called Messiah because he freed the Israelites from their captivity in Babylon. The Messiah of the Psalms of Solomon is not some supernatural being, but a descendant of David who will re-establish David's righteous kingdom. Another work attributed to the great king is the Odes of Solomon, a collection of 42 Christian hymns with a decidedly Jewish slant. Scholars think they were originally composed in Syriac, about 100 AD. They may draw from the same tradition as the Gospel of John. In the final work attributed to the king, the Testament of Solomon, there are enough hints for scholars to assign it to a Greek-speaking Christian, perhaps writing in Palestine in the 1st century AD. It professes to be Solomon's own account of his experiences during the building of the temple. Solomon had learnt that his chief overseer was plagued by a demon who every evening took half of his wages and drew the life out of him by sucking the thumb of his right hand. Solomon appealed for help to God and received a ring of magic power from the archangel Michael. This ring lets Solomon summon demons to account. Here's a sample. Quote, Testament of Solomon 4:1. Beelzebul went off and showed me Oniskelus, who had a very beautiful form. Her body was that of a woman with a fair complexion, but her legs were those of a mule. When she came to me, I said to her, Tell me who you are. She responded, My name is Oniskelus. I am a spirit which has been made into a body. I recline in a den on the earth. I make my home in caves. Sometimes I strangle men. Sometimes I pervert them from their true natures. Most of the time my habitats are cliffs, caves, and ravines. Frequently I also associate with men who think of me as a woman, especially with those whose skin is honey-coloured, for we are of the same constellation. It is also true that they worship my star secretly and openly. They do not know that they deceive themselves and excite me to be an evildoer all the more, for they want to obtain gold by remembering me. I said to her, By what heavenly body do you travel? She replied, By the full moon, because by the moon I pass over more things. Then I said, What angel thwarts you? She responded, One that is also in you, king. So I uttered the name of the Holy One of Israel and commanded her to spin the hemp for the ropes used in the construction of the temple of God. She was sealed and bound in such a way that she was made powerless, so that she had to stand day and night to spin the hemp. End quote. The book is a folk tale, combined with ancient lore about magic and astrology. At one level, it's an Arabian Nights rollicking story of a magician and his contests with a variety of demons. At another, the book is a repository for serious magical lore. The book marks the beginning of a long and popular tradition about Solomon the great magician, but a Solomon who will fall because of his idolatry. It is all very like Faust. With Solomon and all his works out of the way, we can at last find out what modern archaeology and scholarship has to say about the United Kingdom. The Bible depicts Saul as the first ruler of all the tribes of Israel. In a lot of ways he resembles Labiu, ruler of the city of Shechem, 300 years before during the late Bronze Age. Shechem is about 30 kilometres due north of Saul's heartland in the hills. I mentioned Labiu back in episode 1.4. There he featured in many of the letters found at the short-lived Egyptian capital of Amarna. At that time, Egypt ran Canaan as a perpetually troubled but strategically important province. The letters found at Amarna are a treasure trove of correspondence between the Egyptian rulers and their ever-bickering vassals. Labiu features as both a complainant and the object of complaints from other cities. Labiu was a Bronze Age warlord living under the benign lordship of Egypt. Saul was a typical Iron Age I chieftain living in a lawless world after the Bronze Age collapse. But both ran chiefdoms in the central Canaanite highlands. Both extended their influence to the west, across the Jordan into the area called the Gilead. Neither made any headway to the east, reaching for the Mediterranean coast through the lush valley of the Jezreel. You could not describe Saul as a king, a man ruling an organised state. He exacted no taxes, relying on gifts and the profits from raids. He had no civil service, relying on family members to run the place. His chiefdom was a loosely defined area of military activity, in the territory of his home tribe of Benjamin, north of Jerusalem, centred on the towns of Gibeon and Bethel. The only time he left this area to go south of Jerusalem into Judah is when he chases his nemesis David. I have a map at my site, www.historyinthebible.com. Why not take a look? What Saul did have was defences. Archaeological digs have uncovered 30 fortifications in the small area around Gibeon and Bethel. They are unique in the Levant of Iron Age I. Saul's state may have been rudimentary, but it could afford to pay for battlements. One interesting question is why the books of Samuel and Chronicles treat Saul so differently. Here is one idea, and probably a pretty good one. The book of Samuel is one of competing narratives. The current consensus is that it was written by the Deuteronomist, the school of scribes working in the southern kingdom of Judah after the fall of Israel, say 700 BC. They survived for generations, only finishing their work during or shortly after the exile. Although the origins of that school lay in the north, these scribes had long been advocates of a monarchy under the only legitimate kings, those of the southern house of David. Saul was a northerner. To the Deuteronomistic historian, Saul was an ill-fated experiment before the real monarchy could be established. If that is so, why do so many favourable stories to Saul survive, and so many hostile stories to David? Saul is never a villain in the book of Samuel. He is just inadequate to the task, and maybe slightly crazy. David is portrayed as a hero, but not as a fine fellow. He connives to steal wives. He works for the enemies of Israel, and conspires in the treacherous deaths of his rivals. How did these stories get there? One good theory is that the Deuteronomist was building his story of the houses of Saul and David at a time when he could not ignore the stories of Saul the hero. Nor could he afford to ignore the traditions hostile to David. But he had enough clout to portray Saul as unfit and to include an apologia to explain David's actions. The only historical period in which this could have happened is in the decades after the Assyrian destruction of Israel, when Israelite refugees fled south to Judah after 720 BC. These refugees regarded Saul of the tribe of Benjamin as the founder of Israel, and brought with them tales of their great first king. They had no love of David and his dynasty. The Deuteronomist had to walk a balancing act between his own tendencies to denigrate Saul and lord the house of David, while acknowledging that many of the refugees from Israel felt the opposite. The Deuteronomist regarded Saul as illicit, but he couldn't vilify him. The Deuteronomist had little choice but to depict Saul with at least some virtues. And so the book of Samuel was to be the narrative that would reconcile north and south within Judah. As I discussed in episode 1.29, the book of Chronicles was written during the late Persian period, 3 centuries after the Deuteronomist was assembling his story. The northern kingdom was long gone, the Israelites integrated with the Judeans. The chronicler regarded the northern kingdom as an abomination, and could afford to defame Saul and leave out the unpleasant tales about David and Solomon. He had no pressure on him to do otherwise. Until the 1980s, the biblical account of the reigns of David and Solomon was accepted at face value. David was the first to unify the 12 tribes into a true nation-state. Unlike the judges, unlike Saul, he was able to impose a solid apparatus of government upon the Hebrews. He created a bureaucracy for both secular and religious functions. David created the nation of Israel and the city which bears his name. Go to Jerusalem today, and you won't walk far before seeing some street or place named after him. David is a towering figure in the Jewish tradition and barely less so in the Christian. To many people, questioning anything about David is to deny the legitimacy of the modern state of Israel. To challenge the authenticity of the biblical tradition is to walk into a minefield. Let me go back to a passage from the modernist scholar Phil Davies that I quoted in the very first episode in this podcast. Quote, "What is worrying to many Israelis and Jews about the ancient Israel debate is that biblical studies, having for so long been a natural advocate of the land always being the land of Israel, is now bringing the notion under critical scrutiny that Israel was the natural or rightful owner of this piece of land. The Bible is not a text of transcendental authority, but a collection of human writings. What is important is not to politicize biblical studies, but to depoliticize it, to distance it from any political stance. Israel is part of the history, as well as the present of Palestine. I think the Bible should not interfere in this way with modern politics. But this does not entail being anti-Jewish. The state of Israel was the result of things more tangible and imperative than divine promises and ancient occupations. The point at issue is not whether an Israel ever existed, but rather whether the historical ancient Israel was like the portrait in the Bible." End quote. In the next episode of The History in the Bible, I discuss how the complacent acceptance of the biblical account of the United Kingdom of David and Solomon was challenged by modern archaeological discoveries. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.